Hello and welcome back to my Pikmin review marathon. This time we're going to be taking a look at the second game released in the series with Pikmin 2 for the GameCube. After really liking the first game in the series though, how will this one end up comparing? Well, let's pop it in and take a look. Just like with the first Pikmin game, Pikmin 2 also received an expanded port which was released on the Nintendo Wii, 5 years after its initial release on the GameCube. Unlike with the first game though, the Wii version of Pikmin 2 is very similar to the original version, only making a couple of more minor changes to the base experience. The Wii version has widescreen support, of course it uses the Wiimote as a motion pointer to allow you to move and throw Pikmin at the same time, but outside of that, everything is mostly exactly the same. So while the Wii port probably is still the better version overall, the GameCube original isn't massively downgraded this time around, and the experience you get with either one of these is pretty much identical. Pikmin 2 opens up exactly where the first game left off, with Olimar having escaped the Pikmin planet after repairing his ship and returning to his home planet of Hockatate. Upon returning though, he discovers that during his absence, the company he works for, Hockatate Freight, has gone bust after losing a shipment of golden Pikpik carrots that an employee named Louie was transporting. With Captain Olimar being the most experienced member of Hockatate Freight, it falls on him to recover the debt of 10,000 Pokos, which apparently is the currency used by Olimar and his species. The easiest way of getting all of this money back is to return to the Pikmin planet and find hidden treasures there. Unfortunately, Olimar's ship that we spent the entire first game fixing is taken off of him to recover a small amount of the company's debt, so we're left with an old rusty ship instead. This time though, there's 2 seats, meaning that Louie can come with us for additional help. I see what they did there. Olimar is pretty much an anagram of Mario, and now we have this sidekick character called Louie, whose name bears a striking resemblance to another certain famous sidekick character. I do love all of these silly little references Nintendo keep putting into these games. Now the actual game begins, and our first objective is to reunite with Louie after he falls out of the ship's cockpit while flying over the planet. The first thing of note here is that we're in a snowy themed environment, which is not only cool because pretty much every game like this always starts with a grassy themed area, but it's also a completely original theme for the Pikmin series, with the first game only having grassy themed areas and a single cave area. So already Pikmin 2 is separating itself from its predecessor. The next new aspect of the game is that we can actually shift control between Olimar and Louie at any time, which is used in a few puzzles throughout the adventure, but is mostly just used to allow you to more effectively multitask, being able to split the 2 characters up and work on 2 objectives at the same time. This was possible in the first game by sending a group of Pikmin to carry an object back to the ship while you take another group to do something else, but because you now have 2 characters who each have full control over the Pikmin, it makes it so that you can do more complex tasks simultaneously. I do kinda find myself wishing that there were more cases of having to solve puzzles by utilising this mechanic though, because there was only 3 or so occasions where this was actually done. Also, I find it quite odd how they made it so you have 2 characters for the entire game, and yet it's not actually playable in 2-player co-op. It honestly feels like this was the intention, but somewhere throughout the game's development, it must have been scrapped for some reason. It is a shame though, because this would have been really cool to have seen. The basic gameplay here is quite similar to the first game, but instead of finding ship parts, you're instead looking for loads of different treasures. Each of these treasures are really varied and can range from something like tin cans, fruit, or even batteries. Something I found really cool is how a lot of these treasures are actually branded products from the real world, which you could say is some shallow product placement. But I disagree. I actually think that this is one of the coolest uses of this I've ever seen, because it 100% confirms that this planet we're on is Earth. Not only adding to the lore of the game, but also grounding the Pikmin world in reality too. When you see a Duracell battery in real life, you can now picture just how small Olimar and the Pikmin are, and it adds so much to the aspect of imagination that I spoke about in my review of the first game. I also absolutely love how you can read Olimar's thoughts on all of these products, as well as hear a sales pitch for all of them, which is created by the ship's AI. Obviously though, neither Olimar or the ship have a clear understanding of exactly what these items are, so it can lead to some funny dialogue, which is incredibly charming. Speaking of the ship's AI, this is actually one of the main characters in the game, and it acts as a sort of overseer of everything that's going on, giving you tutorials early in the game, and giving you information about the world throughout your adventure. Based on everything I've said so far, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Pikmin 2 is just more of the same from the first game. However, there's several key differences that this game makes to the formula that really do separate it from the predecessor. So, let's take a look at some of these differences, shall we? Firstly, there's no longer a lingering time limit for the game, and you can take things at your own pace. While it still uses a day-by-day system, with each day being roughly 15 minutes of real-world time, there's no limit on how many days you can spend on the planet. I'm actually not sure if this is explained, but I can only assume that Olimar and Louis brought better life support systems with them this time around. Or maybe Olimar's suit was damaged in the first game, which is why it only lasted for 30 days. Either way, regardless of what the in-universe explanation for this is, the result is that you now have an infinite amount of days to spend on the planet. I'm a little bit mixed on this because it does take away from the feeling of survival that the first game had, but I do completely understand why they removed this for the second game, because it turns out it's far, far longer than the first game. And a lot of the reason for this is these new cave areas that you explore. So as you're walking around the normal levels and finding the treasures, you'll very often come across these caves which you can enter. The thing is though, is that when you enter a cave, you'll only have access to the Pikmin that you take in there with you. So let's say you enter a cave and lose 10 Pikmin, you can't get those 10 Pikmin back until you escape the cave. It makes you think a lot more about how to keep as many of the Pikmin you have with you alive. Whereas normally it wouldn't matter too much if you lost a few in a big fight, here, losing those Pikmin could be detrimental because you might need them later on. It's a really good concept, and it's something that makes you play the game completely differently to how you did in the first game. Not only are the caves great for this new gameplay style though, but they also have quite a lot of visual variety too. With some being standard looking caves, some being snowy, some being sewers, and then you also have a couple of more abstract ones as well. Like this bathroom themed one, this one that's like a kid's playroom, or this one that's on a kitchen table. Because the caves are removed from the theme of the outside world, they could really get crazy with them here, and I really like what they did with this. I almost would have liked them to have taken this even further and had even more crazy stuff. Like maybe there could have been a level where you were inside the GameCube console and the Pikmin could have broken it, which affected the TV screen or caused the controller to violently vibrate or something. Or maybe there could have been a theme set in space where there's low gravity so the Pikmin fly off when you throw them. Or it could have been like in Mario Galaxy where the levels rotated on a sphere. There's so many amazing concepts that you could come up with for this, and I would love to see this expanded in a future game. These cave areas are no joke either. Some of the later ones are actually quite difficult, and I sometimes had a single boss enemy murder every single one of my Pikmin because of a stupid decision I made. Luckily the game will automatically save upon reaching every sub-level of the cave that you get to, so if you reset the console, you'll only be taken back to the start of the sub-level you're on. You don't need to start the whole cave again. That would have been way too unforgiving, so I'm glad they didn't do that. What's interesting about this though is that when you restart the game and continue from the level of the cave you're on, you'll probably notice that it's a little bit different than when you played through it before. And that's because these caves are actually randomly generated. This is actually super interesting, and it feels like something you would see in a much more modern game. It can end up making Pikmin 2 feel a bit like a roguelike game. Especially when you consider that there is an element of permadeath if you lose all of your Pikmin and don't reset your game. What's great about this though is that you can't just learn the level layouts and then breeze through them without losing any Pikmin, because the layouts will change every single time you play through them, which does also add an element of replay value too. It would have also been really annoying if there was some kind of time limit while inside these caves, but luckily when you enter them, the time of day doesn't actually move, meaning that you've got all the time in the world to strategize without being punished for it. The bosses here are a true highlight of the game as well. Some of them return from Pikmin 1, like the burrow in Snagret, or the final boss of the game, the Emperor Bullblax, who is a lot easier to defeat in this game, but sometimes appears in pairs, making them still quite scary to encounter. But on top of that we have some new bosses too, the most memorable of which being the Water Wraith and the Man at Legs. The Man at Legs is similar to a spider boss which was fought in the first Pikmin game and returns in Pikmin 2 in several areas. But this particular version of the boss is really weird because it's mechanical rather than being organic, which is really odd when you actually start thinking about it, because this thing was created by someone, but who and why remains a mystery. It also stands out from any other enemy because it straight up has a machine gun that insta-kills any Pikmin it hits. It's really goddamn weird and easily stands out as one of the most interesting enemies in the game. The Water Wraith is really cool too though, because it's the only enemy that actually appears outside of its boss arena and stalks you throughout the entire cave. This thing is like a watery jelly baby that uses 2 concrete pillars to roll around with and crushes any Pikmin it touches. Adding to the threat this thing presents is the fact that it's literally invincible until you enter its actual arena at the bottom of the cave. Honestly, this particular cave was so tense, it's unreal. I was dreading this thing appearing, and whenever it did, it forced me to completely change my strategy for collecting treasure. It feels like it belongs in a horror game or something. It's super cool, and it's easily the most distinct enemy in the entire series so far. So based on all of this, it's quite clear that I really like these cave areas. However, what I will say is that each of these caves, outside of the first couple, take around an hour to complete, and there's a lot of them, with each of the game's 4 levels having 3 or 4 caves to explore. This makes for a grand total of 14 caves, which if we say take an hour each, that's 14 hours of gameplay that you're spending in these caves. That's all well and good if you actually enjoyed the gameplay style within the caves, but if you didn't like this more punishing and difficult gameplay, this would be a serious issue. I praised Pikmin 1 for being a relaxing experience and said that it would be a game that I would revisit a lot in the future because of how replayable it is. A lot of the reason that I felt inclined to replay the game in the future is also because it's a fairly short game too. But Pikmin 2 is an entirely different beast. It's difficult, it's very long, and while it's an awesome adventure to go through, it's nowhere near as replayable as the first game. This isn't a bad thing at all. In fact, I actually love this about the 2 games because it really highlights just how different they are. Honestly, Pikmin 2 could be one of the best game sequels I've ever played because it doesn't aim to replicate the first game and just do things better, but instead it aims to give you a different experience based on the same mechanics from the first game. Both of them offer something totally distinct and are worth playing for their own reasons. We've ended up talking a lot about all of the different caves in the game, but what about all of the actual levels outside of these caves? Are they any good? Well, this is actually where I think Pikmin 2 is maybe slightly weaker than the first game. Because so much of your time is spent in these dungeon-like cave areas, the actual levels aren't really all that memorable. They're still good, of course, but I feel like the ones in the first game were much more tightly designed and made you think a lot more about how to tackle certain obstacles by utilising the Pikmin types. Pikmin 2 does still do this, and in fact there's some really interesting bits where you need to lower water levels by using the blue Pikmin, which then allows the other types to traverse to areas they couldn't before. There's also a couple of standout moments where you need to use the 2 playable characters to complete puzzles, but like I said earlier, these moments are very few and far between. There's just nothing quite like the bit I mentioned in the first Pikmin game where you need to use all 3 types to accomplish a task. Most of the puzzles in Pikmin 2 are completable with only 1 Pikmin type, and it's obvious what you need to do straight away. Pikmin 2's difficulty is much more about combat and avoiding environmental threats within the caves, rather than exploration or puzzle solving. Which is a tiny bit of a shame considering that those 2 elements were my favourite things from the first game. Something I do really like though is how in Pikmin 2 you don't just enter a map screen and have all of the collectibles displayed there like you did in the first game. In Pikmin 2 you gain an item that vibrates the closer you are to a treasure, so you still need to actually explore in order to find everything rather than knowing exactly where it is from the get-go. This is actually something I didn't really think about in Pikmin 1 because it still felt like I was finding the ship pieces on my own. Probably because there was more of a puzzle to actually get the pieces, so it was more about that than actually finding them initially. But I do prefer the way Pikmin 2 handles this, in terms of not just marking everything on a map automatically. It's a small detail, but another improvement the sequel makes to the first game. It's also a slight shame that yet again all of the level themes are pretty much the same, with the first level being snowy, which is really cool, but then all of the others are grassy again. Sure, the seasons change with each level representing winter, spring, summer and autumn, but the latter 3 kind of feel very similar. It's a shame that there wasn't a really windy and stormy level, or a level that was way more industrial or something to separate the visuals up a bit, and make the levels feel distinct with some unique gimmicks. One thing that is very interesting though that I almost forgot to mention is that one of the levels here called Perplexing Pool is actually the same level as the Distant Spring from the first game. The layout is slightly different and there's a lot of new elements added in to make use of the Pikmin's new abilities, but it's kinda strange how they reused this in the second game. I kinda wonder what the reason for this was. Did they think that they underutilized this area in the first game? Or maybe they just wanted to make it clear that you're exploring the same part of the planet as the first game. Either way, it was actually really cool revisiting this area but with all of the new things added in. Something you're probably waiting for me to mention if you've played Pikmin 2 before is all of the new Pikmin types featured in this game. So, let's talk a little bit about them. Pikmin 1 featured 3 types of Pikmin, the reds, yellows and blues. These all return in the second game and all have the same attributes, aside from the yellow ones which have been modified slightly. They can still be thrown higher and further than the other types, but they no longer can pick up bomb rocks and instead are resistant to electric. I think this probably makes a bit more sense. With the red and blue ones having an environmental resistance, it was a little bit weird how the yellows were kinda randomly just given bomb rocks instead. What is a little bit strange though is that bomb rocks do still appear in Pikmin 2, but the yellows can't do anything with them. Maybe it's because the rocks are much bigger in this game, so they're too heavy? It could be that maybe the yellows can still pick up the smaller bomb rocks, but because none actually appear in the second game, they just never have an opportunity to use them. That would be my in-universe explanation for this anyway. New to Pikmin 2 though are 3 brand new types of Pikmin. The first being purple Pikmin, who are now my absolute favourites because of how chunky and cute they are, and because they're straight up the best ones. These are really heavy and can carry 10 times the amount of any other Pikmin type. This means that if you come across a treasure that needs 10 Pikmin to carry, just a single purple Pikmin will be able to lift it. The purple Pikmin don't have a particular resistance to anything though, and instead just excel at combat, dealing far more damage than even the red Pikmin do. But to balance this out, they also move really slowly, making them easy targets for enemies. You could easily become overpowered by having loads of these by your side, but another way this is balanced is that you can actually only get purple Pikmin inside of the caves. The way that this works is that you have to throw any other type of Pikmin into a purple flower. which then turns that Pikmin into a purple Pikmin. Because the purples also don't have their own onion, you can't make them pick up pellets or enemy corpses to spawn in more purples. So if you lose any of this Pikmin type, they're very difficult to actually get back. The second new type of Pikmin is similar in the way that they can only be obtained in caves but by using the white flowers instead. And these of course are the white Pikmin, which are super fast and are resistant to poison. With these having an elemental resistance, they're basically used in the same way that the red, yellow and blues are. Using them to get through poison areas, deactivate whatever's causing the poison, and then allowing you to progress through the level. Then the last new Pikmin type is this really weird one that's called a Bulbmin. These are really strange because they're actually a parasite Pikmin which take control of other creatures, in this case with them controlling a Bulborb. This leads me to believe that in the bad ending of Pikmin 1, the reason Olimar is able to be transformed into a Pikmin is because he's been taken over by these parasite Pikmin, which kinda gives the bad ending a darker tone than what was probably intended. The Bulbmin are also unique in the way that they can only be found in caves, but can't be taken out of the cave that they live in. They can be thrown into coloured flowers to turn them into regular Pikmin though, and this is one of the only ways that you can increase your Pikmin count while inside of a cave, making them actually quite useful. There's actually quite a few smaller changes that Pikmin 2 makes to the first game that mostly all boil down to being simple quality of life improvements, but when all of these changes are combined, they do make the game quite significantly better. So, let's talk about some of these changes, shall we? Well, firstly, probably one of my biggest issues with the first game has been completely fixed. You now have the ability to switch which type of Pikmin you have in your hand without needing to dismiss the entire group and select them all manually. This became a real problem in the first game, especially during combat, but now, in Pikmin 2, this is no longer an issue at all. This was a much needed change, and I'm really happy to see it implemented here. Something that I wasn't expecting to see here though, is that upon defeating each of the bosses found at the bottom of all of the caves in the game, you'll receive a treasure which actually grants you a new ability. This is something I mentioned in my review of the first game, saying that some of the ship pieces should have granted you a new ability or something, but honestly that was just kind of a nitpick. But in Pikmin 2, they actually did what I said. You end up getting loads of new abilities throughout the adventure, which gives you an awesome sense of progression and is hugely rewarding for going through the trouble of completing the lengthy caves. Some of these new abilities include resistance to fire and electric, a greater range on your whistle, the ability to instantly pluck Pikmin from the ground by whistling, greater movement speed, and way more. Basically, every single issue I had with the first game has been fixed here. I wanted a Pikmin switching mechanic, I wanted more variety in level themes, and I wanted more unlockables, which this game gives us with all of these new abilities. The only thing that remains maybe a little bit of a nitpicky issue is that I would have liked to have seen a bit more story here. There is a bit more going on in the second game, don't get me wrong, but it's still a situation where nothing actually happens outside of the intro cutscene and the ending. Speaking of the ending, let's talk about it, shall we? Just like with the first game, I'm going to put a spoiler warning here, and you can skip to the time displayed on the screen now if you want to discover the ending for yourself. But, for anybody else, let's go. Unlike Pikmin 1, which had 3 endings based on how well you did, Pikmin 2 only has a single ending, which is where Olimar recovers the debt and returns home, only to discover that he's accidentally left Louis behind. This is where the post-game section begins, and you're tasked with not only finding Louis, but also getting all 201 pieces of treasure left behind on the planet. And let me tell you now, this is no easy feat. Completing this game to 100% took me over 20 hours. This makes Pikmin 2 one of the longest games I've ever reviewed. In fact, thinking about it, it could even be the longest. Either way though, you eventually find Louis, who's hidden himself away in a cave. And this is where the final boss takes place, where Louis is stuck on top of a spider creature that uses weapons against you, which all correlate to the Pikmin types that you've been using throughout the game. This is a really difficult final boss if you don't know what you're doing, and it took me several attempts to work out a good strategy for this. Basically, the objective is to knock all of the weapons off of the creature one by one, gradually reducing its offensive capabilities and giving you more openings to attack with your different Pikmin. What I would recommend here though is that you just use the yellow Pikmin, because they're by far the easiest ones to actually attack with, due to them being thrown a lot higher than the other types. Destroy the water tap first, because this is the only weapon that can attack from a long range, and then gradually destroy the other weapons while attempting to avoid all of the elemental attacks that it uses, which is easier said than done, believe me. After all of that though, you finally rescue Louis, and then you get the last treasures that you need. The last treasure for me was this 1 kilogram weight, which requires 1000 Pikmin to carry. With you only being able to have 100 Pikmin in the field, this at first seems impossible. But then, you remember. Purple Pikmin are 10 times stronger than regular Pikmin, right? Meaning that you need 100 purple Pikmin to carry this thing. So then I had to go back and farm loads of purple Pikmin, go back to the weight, and finally get all of the treasures. After doing this, you get the true ending of the game, where you return home with Louis, and Hocotate Freight flourishes due to the riches you've amassed on your adventure. Something I should probably mention here is that while Louis is missing, the second playable character actually becomes the CEO of Hocotate Freight, who at the start of the game was sending you emails after the end of every day. This makes it so that if any puzzles remain that need the 2 playable characters, you can still do them even without Louis. There's this ongoing theory that Olimar has about Louis, that he was actually in control of the big spider boss at the end of the game, which would actually make Louis a secret antagonist. I guess his motive for attacking Olimar would be that he left him behind on the planet and resented him for it. But this Louis character keeps his cards close to his chest, so we might never know for sure. Now, after 20 hours of gameplay, you would assume that my time with Pikmin 2 would be over. But actually, there's a challenge mode and a brand new 2-player battle mode to go through. Geez, this game just never ends, does it? Despite the challenge mode sharing the same name as the mode from Pikmin 1, it's actually completely different to the first game's challenge mode. Whereas in the first game it was just a side mode where you needed to see how many Pikmin you could grow in a single day, in Pikmin 2 this has been massively fleshed out, instead being a level-based mode which is similar to the caves from the main game. Each level of the challenge mode gives you a set number of Pikmin and tasks you with completing the areas as quickly as possible, collecting as much treasure as possible, and killing as few Pikmin as possible. This is far better than the challenge mode from the first game and offers something distinct from the main game because it's a lot easier to just jump into and have a quick session. But the best thing about Pikmin 2's challenge mode? It's 2-player co-op, baby! Finally, this is something I've been thinking the Pikmin games should have had for ages now, and I didn't actually expect to see it tucked away in the challenge mode here. If you have a friend to play this with, then this makes the challenge mode even more distinct from the main game and all the more worth experiencing. While this is good though, playing it in multiplayer is a little bit finicky, which is due to the fact that you aren't assigned your own Pikmin and rather you share the same group. This can make it a little bit difficult to properly work together because you're constantly fighting over which Pikmin belong to who. So maybe this co-op system could have done with a little bit more thought being put into it, but it's still a lot of fun and makes it all the more strange that the co-op wasn't included in the main game. The challenge mode is definitely a huge improvement over the original game, especially considering the addition of multiplayer. However, this isn't the best mode to play in multiplayer, because that is the battle mode. This is a competitive Pikmin experience where you and another player are placed in a fairly large arena filled with enemy creatures. and the objective is to get 4 marbles back to your base before the other player does so. The twist here though is that you can also aim to steal a single coloured marble which is located in your opponent's base, and doing this will instantly win the game regardless of how many of the other marbles your enemy has collected. So the strategy here can either be to be super aggressive and attempt to steal the marble from the enemy base, or you can play it safer and collect 4 of the other marbles that are scattered around the level. Occasionally you'll also be granted with power-ups which allow you to spawn in extra Pikmin for yourself, or you can place traps or other enemies directly in front of the other player. So it actually becomes really chaotic in the longer matches and can be extremely tense. Despite the idea of competitive Pikmin being a little bit strange, it actually works really well here and it's loads of fun. If you've never tried this, I would highly recommend that you give it a go. But that sums up everything there is to talk about with Pikmin 2. It basically just takes everything from the first game and expands it, giving us a more fleshed out challenge mode, a new battle mode, making the main game much longer and more difficult, and also adding in the cave structure too. And while this new cave structure does somewhat detract from the normal Pikmin experience that we got with the first game, I do think this works to the game's advantage because it separates the sequel from the original and makes them both worth playing in their own right. I'm putting Pikmin 2 in first place in my series ranking. To be honest though, this is a little bit debatable. While I do think Pikmin 2 is hands down an overall better game, fixing pretty much every issue I had with the first one and also offering a ton of new things too, I have to say I would be much more likely to replay Pikmin 1 over this. Pikmin 1 being shorter, easier, and not having the cave structure makes it more replayable in my opinion. And while Pikmin 2 is the better experience, I don't feel any particular desire to go back to it anytime soon. Pikmin 1 almost feels more arcade-like in the way that I want to go back and beat all of my high scores. Whereas Pikmin 2 doesn't really do this because it would take far too long to do another run of the game to improve my score. It's one of those cases where although I do acknowledge that Pikmin 2 is better, I personally prefer Pikmin 1. It's a lot less stressful, and I think I prefer that sort of experience with Pikmin over the more challenging experience you get with Pikmin 2. I do love the purple Pikmin though, they're my favourites for sure. And that's Pikmin 2. Next time in my Pikmin review marathon we're going to be taking a look at Pikmin 3, but unlike with the first 2 games, we're actually going to be taking a look at the definitive version of Pikmin 3, with Pikmin 3 Deluxe released on the Nintendo Switch. I know that so far I've been taking a look at the Pikmin games in their original format, but I already own this game for the Switch, so it wouldn't really make sense for me to go out and buy the Wii U version when I've already got this right here in my hand. It might take me a little while to actually get around to making my review of this because I've got a lot of other videos coming out in the very near future, but it won't take me too long to get around to it, I promise. Until then though, give this video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and leave a comment down below letting me know what you think to Pikmin 2. And until next time, bye!